Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Doug had dug his own grave the moment he went to Bill for help in taking down the casino boss. Doug had convinced himself that Bill was the kind of man who could provide an escape hatch from Joey Armstrong's stranglehold. What he failed to realize, however, was that Bill and Joey had once been partners, and not just in passing. They had shared money, done deals in the shadows, and understood each other's ruthlessness far too well. For Doug, this was not a lifeline, but a trap disguised as salvation. Bill was never the ally Doug imagined. Instead, he was the messenger who would carry Doug's desperation straight back to Joey. And from that moment, the clock began ticking on the most harrowing chapter of Doug's life. The first wave of paranoia crept in slowly, like a storm building on the horizon. Doug had always prided himself on being calculated, a man who could rationalize his way out of most predicaments. But this time, his misstep left him defenseless. The realization that Bill had likely betrayed him gnawed at his conscience, yet Doug tried to hold himself together. He told himself that Joey might not see him as a threat, that perhaps Bill would stay silent. But deep down, Doug knew better. Joey Armstrong was a man who had built his empire not just on power but on fear, and anyone who dared plot against him, no matter how small or sloppy the plan, would pay for it. Doug's anxiety was mirrored by Marcel Malone, who found himself balancing two worlds at once. Malone was part of a secretive organization with tentacles reaching far beyond the borders of Fairmont Crest, and his every move seemed to echo Joey's agenda. Yet Jacob's watchful eyes complicated everything. Jacob had never trusted Malone, and his instincts told him that the man's loyalties were murkier than they appeared. While Doug was spiraling into a mess of betrayal and paranoia, Malone was quietly executing Joey's orders. The chilling memory of how Malone had taken care of Kenny, violent, methodical, and almost ritualistic, raised the haunting question of whether Doug would receive the same treatment. Kenny's fate had been sealed in silence, his screams smothered by the walls of secrecy. Doug, unaware of the exact details but fully conscious of Joey's capacity for cruelty, began to wonder if his own days were numbered. Meanwhile, Randy stood at a crossroads. His loyalty to Doug had always been tested, stretched thin by Doug's reckless decisions, but it had never completely snapped. Randy knew better than anyone how dangerous Joey's web could be, and the last thing he wanted was to be caught in it. But friendship has its own gravity, and Randy couldn't just stand by while his friend marched toward his own destruction. Against his better judgment, Randy picked up the phone to warn Doug. His voice trembled with urgency as he urged Doug to be careful, to stay alert, to trust no one. Yet fate had a cruel sense of timing. Vanessa, walking past as Doug's phone lit up with Randy's name, caught the moment. Her eyes lingered on the screen, questions forming before Doug even answered the call. Trust in their marriage was already fragile, and this new discovery gave her one more reason to doubt him. Complications multiplied when Bill saw Doug and Vanessa sharing a quiet meal together at a local restaurant. To Bill, it seemed like nothing more than a couple attempting to patch up their strained marriage. But the truth was far darker. Randy's warning had made Vanessa more suspicious, and while she sat across from Doug with a smile painted on her face, her mind raced with the question of whether her husband was hiding more than he admitted. Did he truly want to escape Joey's grip, or was he quietly colluding in some new scheme? Bill didn't know that Randy was secretly guiding Doug. Joey didn't know that Vanessa was piecing together more than she let on. The tangled secrecy made every small gesture feel loaded with menace, and Doug found himself trapped between appearances and reality. Joey, ever the puppeteer, grew impatient. He wanted results, not excuses. Malone and Bill were instructed to accelerate the plan, to ensure Doug had no time to regroup or rethink. Joey's method was simple: remove Vanessa from the town, strip Doug of his emotional anchor, and watch the man collapse. Yet with Vanessa gone, the collateral damage would inevitably extend to the children. Doug's heart clenched at the thought. He had failed Vanessa in countless ways, but his children were the last line he swore to protect. And now even they stood on the edge of Joey's vendetta. Vanessa's actions only deepened the fracture between her and Doug. When she refused to follow his advice to stay close, to trust him against Joey's manipulations, Doug began to suspect that she had chosen her side. In his mind, every hesitation, every cold glance, became proof that Vanessa might have aligned with Joey, either willingly or under pressure. The idea crushed him, yet it also fueled his survival instincts. For the first time, Doug realized that he could no longer rely on the people closest to him. If he wanted to live, he had to carve his own path. And so, with fear disguised as determination, Doug reached out to Jacob. Contacting Jacob was not a decision made lightly. Jacob was skeptical, meticulous, and above all else, distrustful of anyone connected to Malone or Joey. Doug knew that asking for help meant laying bare his vulnerabilities, admitting that he had been complicit in things that could destroy him if brought into the light. Still, the risk felt necessary. Doug confided in Jacob, revealing snippets of the truth, careful not to incriminate himself too deeply but desperate enough to beg for protection. Jacob listened, his expression unreadable, weighing every word like evidence in a courtroom. For Jacob, this was more than Doug's cry for help. It was a potential key to unlocking the broader corruption he had long suspected. Doug's willingness to cooperate opened a dangerous new door. He could help gather evidence, but doing so would place him directly in Joey's crosshairs. Every conversation, every secret meeting with Jacob had to be masked with the normal rhythm of his crumbling life. He couldn't let Vanessa suspect his double dealings, couldn't let Malone catch the flicker of rebellion in his eyes, couldn't let Randy's concern draw unwanted attention. It was a tightrope walk over a pit of knives, and the further Doug went, the paranoia metastasized. Nights grew longer, each shadow cast against the wall a reminder of Joey's reach. Doug began checking locks twice, scanning the street outside his home, second-guessing every voice message left on his phone. He felt hunted, even in his own home. When Vanessa left town under Joey's directive, Doug's loneliness curdled into desperation. He replayed their last conversations over and over in his mind, dissecting her tone, her pauses, her lack of defiance. Was she protecting their children by cooperating? Or was she quietly ensuring Doug's downfall by aligning herself with Joey's power? Each possibility hurt in its own way, and each left Doug more isolated. Jacob's suspicion of Malone deepened with every shred of information Doug provided. Patterns emerged, ties between Joey's schemes and Malone's brutal methods. Kenny's fate became a chilling blueprint, a reminder that Malone carried out orders with terrifying precision. Jacob feared that Doug would soon become the next name on Malone's list. Yet Jacob also recognized the value of Doug's insider knowledge. With Doug's help, he could finally trace Joey's financial webs, the shell companies, the forged medical files, the laundering operations that disguised crime as commerce. The evidence was within reach, but gathering it meant placing Doug in even greater danger. Doug's internal conflict tore at him. Every act of cooperation with Jacob carried the weight of betrayal of Joey, betrayal of Malone, and even betrayal of Vanessa, who remained in the dark about his clandestine alliance. He hated the duplicity, but he also knew it was the only path forward. He was no longer just a desperate man with gambling debts, he was now a pawn in a war between Joey's empire and Jacob's investigation. And pawns, as Doug knew all too well, were often sacrificed long before the game was over. The tension escalated when Malone began watching Doug more closely. Conversations felt like interrogations. Innocent encounters were laced with veiled threats. Malone would smile, but his eyes remained cold, calculating, as if already imagining the best way to dispose of Doug should Joey give the order. Doug's every instinct screamed that he was running out of time. The memories of Kenny haunted him. Malone's reputation ensured that Doug's imagination filled in every horrific detail. The question was not if Malone would come for him, but when. And yet, amidst the suffocating fear, Doug felt a flicker of defiance. He could not be Kenny. He would not allow himself to be discarded without a fight. Each meeting with Jacob became less about survival and more about resistance. Doug began documenting, memorizing details, carefully building a mental archive of Joey's crimes. He watched Bill more closely too, trying to understand the man who had betrayed him. Bill seemed to thrive under Joey's command, his betrayal of Doug almost casual, as if it barely mattered. That indifference fueled Doug's anger, transforming his fear into a fragile but growing resolve. Still, Doug's biggest torment remained Vanessa. Her absence gnawed at him, the unanswered question of her loyalty tearing at his heart. He remembered her eyes when she saw Randy's name flash on his phone, the suspicion that never left her face after that. He replayed her decision to follow Joey's directives instead of his pleas, wondering if it was cowardice, strategy, or betrayal. The uncertainty was unbearable. Love and paranoia intertwined until Doug no longer knew whether he was fighting to save his family or simply fighting to prove to himself that he hadn't already lost them. As Joey's pressure mounted, Doug found himself standing at the edge of a precipice. Each move he made with Jacob risked exposure. Each moment with Malone risked violence. Each memory of Vanessa risked despair. The walls of Fairmont Crest seemed to close in, every alleyway and shadow a reminder that Joey's reach was inescapable. Doug had chosen to fight back, but the question that lingered was whether he could withstand the storm once Joey discovered the truth. Doug's world narrowed into a blur of suspicion, alliances, and unfinished truths. Bill had set the first domino in motion, but the weight of his betrayal continued to ripple. He had spoken Doug's name to Joey without hesitation, sealing the man's fate in ways even Bill did not fully anticipate. Yet Bill himself was not immune to Joey's grip. Old debts and old loyalties tied him like invisible chains, and though he acted like a man in control, he was more servant than partner. That duality made Bill dangerous. He knew how to manipulate appearances, how to keep Joey's trust while deflecting blame, and he would not hesitate to throw Doug or anyone else under the bus if it bought him another week of safety. Marcel Malone remained the most unpredictable presence. His reputation preceded him, not just as an enforcer but as a man with shadows that stretched far beyond the town. The organization he answered to was a mystery, but its rules were clear. Loyalty was non-negotiable, and disobedience meant ruin. Malone played his part well, advancing Joey's agenda with ruthless efficiency, but Jacob's eyes on him slowed the machine. Jacob wasn't content with whispers or suspicions. He hunted for tangible proof, digging into records, cross-referencing movements, and following the faint trail Malone left behind. Malone could feel the weight of Jacob's scrutiny, and though he brushed it off outwardly, internally he began calculating how long he could maintain the charade before Jacob closed in. Kenny's brutal fate loomed like a ghost over every interaction with Malone. The memory of how swiftly and mercilessly Malone had handled him whispered to everyone involved that this man was not to be trifled with. If Joey gave the word, Doug would be handled the same way, efficiently, quietly, and without hesitation. The question was whether Joey was ready to cash in on that option, or if Malone himself might decide to act preemptively to prove loyalty. Randy's role became increasingly fragile. His decision to warn Doug had been born from friendship, but he knew the danger of being caught in between. Joey tolerated no interference, and Randy's phone call, though brief, had the power to unravel everything. Vanessa had seen the call, her mind already spinning in directions Randy never intended. She knew the call meant Randy was still involved, still tethered to Doug's spiral. The dilemma for Randy was clear: should he distance himself now and let Doug face whatever was coming, or should he take a more active role in trying to save a man who seemed intent on his own destruction? Each time he saw Doug's name flash in his phone history, Randy felt the tightening knot of dread, aware that every choice he made carried life or death consequences. Vanessa herself emerged as the most conflicted figure of all. She had endured the revelation of Doug's gambling debts, the lies that accumulated like rust corroding the foundations of their marriage, and now she found herself staring at forces larger than either of them. Joey's reach was impossible to deny. His command to pull her out of town was not a suggestion but an order, and Vanessa understood that refusal would put her children directly in harm's way. Yet the thought of obeying Joey left her sickened. Was she truly keeping her family safe, or was she walking them into a cage of Joey's design? The sight of Randy's call made her question whether Doug was secretly conspiring, and that suspicion pressed heavily on her. If Doug was already playing both sides, then where did that leave her? A pawn to be traded, or worse, a liability to be discarded? Jacob stood apart but never idle. His suspicions of Malone had grown into a near obsession, but Doug's quiet cooperation gave him new leverage. He began to see connections, threads linking Malone's brutality to Joey's larger scheme, and Doug's testimony filled in gaps that no outsider could have guessed. Still, Jacob was cautious. He knew Doug's fear could twist truth, exaggerate danger, or omit crucial details. His task was to separate desperation from fact, and in doing so, he risked exposing himself as much as Doug. If Joey or Malone suspected that Jacob had found an inside source, the game would shift violently, and Jacob knew his own survival would hang in the balance. Bill, Malone, Randy, Vanessa, Jacob, each of them orbited around Doug, but each carried their own weight. And in that unstable constellation, Joey's presence remained like a black hole, pulling everything inevitably toward destruction. Joey demanded progress. He pushed Malone harder, pressed Bill for updates, tightened his grip on Vanessa's choices. His plan was simple but effective: dismantle Doug's support system piece by piece, until the man was alone and helpless. Moving Vanessa out of town wasn't just about control, it was about breaking Doug's spirit, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, he would have no one left to turn to. Yet Joey underestimated the resilience born from desperation. Doug's contact with Jacob was more than an act of survival, it was a seed of resistance. Each risk he took gathering fragments of evidence, each whisper he passed along, added fuel to a fire Joey hadn't anticipated. Malone's watchful eye made the task nearly impossible, but Doug began to move with the subtlety of a man who knew his life depended on deception. He memorized details, catalogued numbers, stored away names and dates in the recesses of his mind, all while wearing the mask of submission when Joey's men came calling. Randy, torn between fear and loyalty, faced his own breaking point. He knew Joey's suspicion could easily shift onto him if his warning to Doug was ever revealed. But abandoning Doug entirely meant living with the guilt of watching a friend be destroyed. His dilemma played out in silence, a battle between self-preservation and conscience, and each day he delayed choosing, the danger around him grew. Vanessa's arc twisted tighter as her children became Joey's unspoken leverage. She tried to act normally, to mask her fear with calm for their sake, but every step out of the house felt like walking on eggshells. Joey's reach followed her, whether through Malone's looming shadow or through the subtle reminders Bill delivered whenever they crossed paths. The possibility that Doug had secretly reached out to Jacob complicated her even further. Was this her chance to break free of Joey's control? Or was it one more reckless gamble from a husband whose decisions had already cost them so much? Jacob's pursuit of truth edged into obsession. He trailed Malone, cross-checked financial records, and began piecing together how Joey funneled money through layers of fraud and shell games. With Doug's whispered confirmations, the puzzle began to form, but Jacob knew it was far from complete. He feared Malone would sense the net closing and strike back. And every time he shadowed the man, Jacob wondered if he was the hunter or the hunted. Malone's own doubts festered as Joey's pressure grew. The closer Jacob pressed, the more Malone realized his actions were under scrutiny. His brutality, once an unquestioned asset, had become a liability drawing attention. His loyalty to Joey was absolute, but even Malone understood that organizations like his valued survival above all else. If Jacob uncovered too much, Malone might have to silence him, and that meant stepping into a spotlight Malone had long avoided. In the shifting currents of fear and suspicion, Doug's fight to protect himself took on new urgency. Each secret meeting with Jacob carried the risk of exposure. Each coded word was a lifeline stretched dangerously thin. His paranoia was no longer just fear, it was survival instinct honed to a razor's edge. He began to see patterns in Bill's movements, cracks in Malone's facade, glimpses of doubt in Vanessa's eyes. And with each revelation came the realization that survival might not depend on defeating Joey outright but on outmaneuvering the people Joey trusted most. The storm was gathering, and every character, Bill with his double-edged loyalties, Malone with his brutal efficiency, Randy with his faltering courage, Vanessa with her conflicted choices, Jacob with his relentless pursuit, was being pulled into its center. What came next would determine not just Doug's fate but the balance of power in Fairmont Crest. And as Joey tightened his grip, the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. When the reckoning came, No one would escape untouched. The storm that had been building finally reached its breaking point. Doug's desperate alliance with Jacob had created a fragile path toward redemption, but it was also a razor-thin line between survival and ruin. Joey's reach was vast, and his suspicion was relentless. Every whispered conversation, every coded message, every lingering glance between Doug and Jacob risked exposure. And when Joey grew impatient, the mask of civility he occasionally wore fell away, revealing the predator beneath. Bill remained the most duplicitous figure in the unfolding drama. He had delivered Doug's weakness to Joey with little hesitation, yet the deeper Joey dragged him into the scheme, the more Bill realized he had created a trap for himself as well. To Joey, loyalty was transactional, not permanent, and Bill's usefulness had an expiration date. He began to sense it in Joey's tone, in the clipped commands that suggested he was less an ally and more a disposable asset. Bill thought he had secured his position by betraying Doug, but now he realized that betrayal might be the only currency Joey understood, and soon someone would use it against him. Marcel Malone remained Joey's blade, sharp and efficient, but Jacob's pursuit left him unsettled. Malone prided himself on precision, on being unseen even as he carried out the darkest tasks. But Jacob had forced him into the light. Each time Jacob drew closer to unraveling the ties between Joey's empire and Malone's hidden organization, Malone understood that his own survival was tied to silence. Doug's fate hung in the balance of Malone's calculation. Was killing Doug the way to prove loyalty once and for all, or would sparing him create leverage against Jacob's investigation? Randy's dilemma reached its climax when he realized silence was no longer an option. Watching from the sidelines had become unbearable, and he knew Doug's time was running short. Randy's loyalty to his friend pushed him toward action, even as fear clawed at his resolve. He chose to step into the fire, reaching out to Doug one last time. This time not with warnings but with an offer to help. That choice sealed Randy's role in the story, not as a bystander, but as a man who finally risked everything for friendship. Vanessa's fracture was the deepest. Torn between protecting her children, obeying Joey, and questioning Doug's secretive behavior, she was caught in an impossible bind. Yet when she saw Joey's grip tighten around not just Doug but the entire family, something inside her hardened. She could no longer play the compliant spouse, could no longer pretend that going along with Joey's commands would keep her children safe. Vanessa's decision came in silence, but it was firm. She would choose neither Joey nor Doug entirely. Instead, she would choose her children, even if it meant exposing truths that would shatter her marriage and put her in Joey's crosshairs. Jacob's investigation finally struck gold. Through Doug's testimony, Randy's whispered confirmations, and his own relentless digging, Jacob uncovered the pattern of Joey's financial laundering, the forged medical records, and the ties to Malone's shadowy network. The evidence was enough to trigger action, but Jacob knew that striking too soon would cost lives. He needed to time it perfect. Lido hit Joey when his empire was exposed but before Malone could erase the witnesses. That calculation made Jacob's every move feel like walking on glass, because a single misstep could mean the end not just of his case but of everyone involved. The climax came in the form of a confrontation that none of them could avoid. Doug, cornered and desperate, was brought face to face with Joey's wrath. The room was suffocating, heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that Joey already suspected Doug's betrayal. Bill stood nearby, silent but uneasy, aware that Joey's gaze could turn on him at any moment. Malone lingered in the background, a predator waiting for the signal to strike. Randy's presence was unexpected. Had forced his way into the circle, refusing to let Doug face this reckoning alone. And Vanessa, drawn back into the storm by her own choices, found herself standing on the edge of truth, her children's safety the only shield she had left. It was Jacob's intervention that shifted the balance. Armed with evidence and backed by silent forces waiting outside the room, he entered not as a supplicant but as a challenger. The confrontation became a crucible where every secret, every betrayal, every divided loyalty was laid bare. Joey, for the first time, was forced to reckon with the possibility that his empire was not unshakable. Bill's betrayal, Malone's brutality, Randy's loyalty, Vanessa's conflict, Doug's resistant soul of it coalesced into a storm Jacob wielded like a weapon. The ending was not clean, because endings in Fairmont Crass never were. Joey's empire did not collapse in a single moment, but cracks spread through it like fractures in glass. Bill's duplicity caught up with him, leaving him isolated. Malone's future remained uncertain, his shadowy network retreating but not destroyed. Randy's courage cost him dearly, but his sacrifice ensured that Doug was not left to die alone. Vanessa's choice to prioritize her children reshaped her life forever, severing ties that could never be repaired. And Doug himself, though scarred and haunted, emerged not as a man redeemed but as a man who had finally stopped running from the consequences of his choices. The reckoning left no one untouched. Joey's grip weakened, Jacob's pursuit gained strength, and Fairmont Crest bore the scars of the war that had played out in its shadows. The story closed not with triumph but with survival, with the knowledge that every character had paid a price for their part in the game. Doug's grave had been dug long ago, but against all odds, he managed to crawl out of it not unscathed, not whole, but alive enough to face whatever came next.